No, you're fine. You're all set. Do you want this? I can keep this up here. No. Okay, well, thank you again to Mark and Anne-Marie, who's just stepped out. My name is Taylor White. I'm a senior policy analyst here at New America. I work on our pre-K-12 team and work across that team in our Center for Education and Skills at New America. And in this role, I lead a lot of our work for the Partnership to Advance Youth Apprenticeship, which Mary Alice referenced earlier. Through PIA, we're working with a number of communities, dozens of communities actually across the country, who are working to try to implement a number of the elements that Mark laid out as sort of the gold standard for what he'd like to see in CTE and vocational systems here in the US. Pathways that connect high school and community college and bachelor's degrees into seamless pathways for students, and pathways that also include a significant portion of students' time in work-based learning settings through youth apprenticeship. There are a number of others as well, but those are two that we see gaining a lot of steam in the work that we do. And I will say that the work through PIA has given us a bit more optimism, I would say, about the state of the US CTE system, and in particular the commitment of educators, policymakers, system leaders, and even business to a growing extent to find a better way forward for students for whom this is a destination. So I think that, I'm absolutely willing to concede that we have this issue where we love programs and we're a little bit less comfortable with systems development, but I think books like this one and international comparative work generally are hugely helpful in providing examples for us and setting a high bar for what's possible if we really are willing to work together to grow these systems. So for that reason, we're very, very excited to be involved in this event today, and we are very pleased to have some of the chapter authors with us to serve on a panel in just a moment, as well as two additional people who are working in two very different roles to improve CTE systems and education systems in this country more broadly. So I am very pleased to announce the folks. I will read your bios first, and then you can come up and storm the stage and take your seats. But joining us tonight for this panel, we have Dr. William Brit Kirwan, who is the chair of the Maryland Commission on Innovation and Excellence in Education. Dr. Kirwan is the Chancellor Emeritus of the University System of Maryland, a position he held for more than a decade. Prior to that role, he was the 26th president of the University of Maryland College Park and the 12th president of The Ohio State University. Kirwan has served in multiple roles at the College Park campus, including as a professor, chair of the Department of Mathematics. We would have never met when I was a student anywhere. Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs and an acting chancellor. He's chaired many boards and commissions, including the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics, the National Research Council Board of Higher Education in the Workforce, the American Council for Higher Education, the Association of the Public and Land-Grant Universities, and the Business Higher Education Forum. In 2016, Governor Larry Hogan appointed Dr. Kirwan to chair the Commission on Innovation and Excellence in Education, which you may recognize as the Kirwan Commission. Next up, we have Nancy Hoffman, who is a senior advisor at Jobs for the Future and an author of two chapters in the Vocational Education and Training for a Global Economy book that we are talking about tonight. Hoffman is co-founder of the Pathways to Prosperity Network, through which she supports states, regions, and cities in efforts to build or improve pathways from high school to a first marketable post-secondary credential. Hoffman has held faculty and administrative positions at institutions including MIT, UMass Boston, Harvard, Brown, Temple, and Portland State. And she serves on the Massachusetts Board of Higher Ed and the boards of the North Bennett Street School and Build Up Birmingham. She has also written and edited numerous books and is co-editor of Harvard Education Press's new Work in Learning book series. Also joining us tonight is one of our partners in the Partnership to Advance Youth Apprenticeship, Janay McClarin, who is a program manager with the National Alliance for Partnerships in Equity. She is the program manager specifically for the Southeast region of the U.S. and has spent over 2 decades working in the fields of service, education, and youth development. Janay began her career as a law enforcement officer in Arkansas. I didn't know that, Janay. Serving as a community resource officer and later as a corporal for the state Capitol Police. She was later dean of students for the Kent School District in Washington State before transitioning to the nonprofit sector. And let's see, she worked serving as the director of Impact for a City Year in Seattle, where she oversaw the implementation of programs focusing on service learning, student achievement, and increasing graduation rates. And last but by no means least, we have Ms. Vivien Stewart, who is a senior advisor for education at the Asia Society, and again, an author of chapters in the book that we are celebrating here tonight. Before her role at the Asia Society, Vivien was Vice President for Education at the Asia Society, where she was responsible for its programs that promote the study of Asia and other world regions, cultures, languages, and global issues in U.S. school, and for building connections between U.S. and Asian education leaders. In the role, she developed a series of international benchmarking exchanges to share expertise between American and Asian education, business, and policy leaders on how to improve education to meet the demands of globalization. She has a number of other accomplishments here that I'm unfortunately going to truncate, but I will tell you that her book, A World-Class Education, Learning from International Models of Excellence and Innovation, was named one of Bill Gates' top 10 books for 2012. So please join me on stage and we can get the conversation started. I think our names.
Yeah, we have to find the right
Okay.
lights.
Oh, there's the book. Okay, so thank you again for joining us here tonight. I want to get the conversation started, I guess, by sort of regrounding us in the conversation around USCTE, or VET, if you will. And I know that Nancy, you and your husband Bob contributed the chapter in the book that's on the US system. So I'm wondering if you could get us started with a sort of response to the overview that Mark's provided, and in particular to his prescriptions for improving the system moving forward.
So it will be no great surprise to Mark that I don't have quite as dim a view about either the systems or the capacities of the young people who are in them, or of community college students, but never mind, we'll move on from there. I think in terms of the overview, though, it has some holes, but I don't think it's entirely off base. I do think there's something that we should be thinking about, and that is, do we need a federal system? We have a number of states that have very strong systems. I happen to come from Massachusetts, which has a remarkable vocational education system, probably 25 institutions serving about 20% of high school students. They're standalone schools. The unfortunate part right now, there are waiting lists of about 3,000 students, and these schools, which are wonderful at launching people into careers as well as into post-secondary education, are now overrun and becoming more the province of the elite because, to answer part of the question that Anne-Marie was asking, they don't just teach carpentry and HVAC and electrical, although that's important. They teach veterinary science, they teach IT, they run businesses that get people out into the labor market. So Tennessee, I would say, has a good system. Delaware has developed a very good system. I would be perfectly happy if we had 50 different systems, but that they were systems. So on the systems piece, I certainly agree with Mark's overview. I think it's also worth noting that something else, which is that Massachusetts is about 6.5 million people. Switzerland is about 8.5 million. So when we're comparing the US to other countries, we need to really take a deep breath, because the breadth of difference in the United States is different from a place like Singapore, particularly, where there's a very high concentration of population.
Sure.
To move on to the prescription, I think anyone who's thought about VET or CTE would agree that we really need to have employers engaged, and that the culture in this country has not been to engage. It's really been to say this is the province of schools. Up until fairly recently, most of our employer-based skills development has gone to middle managers and above. And I'm going to say a word about that before I jump off here. But I think there's a difference in the way I would explain, particularly what Switzerland does, and the way we talk loosely about employer engagement. And I think it's a kind of important nuance that a lot of people miss, which is that in the Swiss system, the standards, the 235, there are actually 235 career qualifications, that's the whole range, from violin making to retail to banking. those standards are developed, first of all, by employer associations. And there's a big difference between saying employer and employer associations, because associations, for example, the associations in Switzerland that manages all of the manufacturing, knows that there are differences among companies. But the goal, and this is the government's role, is to keep the skills training broad enough so that the person being trained owns the skills and can sell them in the marketplace. And in fact, that's what happens. About 30 to 50% of young people in Switzerland who complete an apprenticeship don't stay in the place where they were trained. They go elsewhere. And this is a really healthy phenomenon, because one industry says, we have this culture, the young person goes to another culture and brings their knowledge and their questions with them. So I think that's an important distinction, and I know Mark knows this, but I think it's, when we talk about building a system here, we shouldn't assume that we're going to go employer by employer. So I think that there are some other things, though, that I would say about the prescription. It might surprise people, although Mark and Anne-Marie were going in this direction. I don't think that there should be a separate CTE system. And the work that we do with Pathways to Prosperity is to develop career-focused education with the notion that, we take 6-year-olds to the firehouse and to the grocery store to see how work goes on. But once students are in middle school and high school, all of that disappears. So our point of view is that we need a system which is career-focused for everyone. Whether you're getting a PhD and want to be a research scientist, you certainly want a career, or an associate's degree. I actually once tried to figure out how we deal with this binary of academic and career, and the best I could come up with was crackademics, and we decided that wasn't going to work. So that's one thing. The second thing is there are really big gaps in the way we prepare young people for the labor market. One of them is work-based learning experience. The second one is really that we, and I think Mark is going here too, I think our system is really misaligned and structured in an unfortunate way for what we really need. What's so striking in Switzerland is that 16 young people begin to do real work. They're not cynical, they haven't failed, they're treated like adults, and they thrive both emotionally, socially, and technically in the labor market. And so here we are trying to make two systems which are misaligned, high school and community college, fit together. The final thing I would say, though, is again a correction to at least Mark's view of community colleges. In Massachusetts, to go back there, CTE, there's no word CTE in post-secondary, but the assumption is that when you go to a community college, you want to get a career, and if you're going to transfer, you may be told, well, you need to take this course in biotech, not those 5 courses, but we are very careful to set up all the general education so it's included in the career program. And there are relatively few short-term programs. If you're going to be in any of the allied health fields, those are 2-year programs with clinical experiences built in. So it's not quite as slipshod as Mark may have given you the impression that it is. And the final thing that I would say is that there's something going on in the country right now which I don't quite know what to make of. But that is, you probably know, Starbucks, for example, is offering, in partnership with ASU, a full bachelor's degree. And that's only one among many companies that are all of a sudden seeming to be creating these opportunities for incumbent workers and to attract workers. Whether that's going to have a real impact on our current CTE system, I don't know. But as we look around and we think about learn and earn, something very interesting is taking place in the US economy. And I think we need to keep an eye on it, because as often in the US, there are little seeds of things popping up that may turn into a quite powerful innovation.
Mm-hmm. particularly if we have a system that's there to catch it and put its arms around it
Right.
and stand it up and make it sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, I just came away from the JFF office where we were brainstorming about how do you map this landscape.
Yep.
Some of these things are much better than other things.
Sure.
Some of them give you a choice. Some of them are outskilling you, so we'll train you, but then get rid of you.
Right.
But, which is what Amazon is doing, but actually better than getting rid of you without training you.
Right.
So I would say we're in the midst of some small but promising
Sure.
and interesting commitment of employers to work in
To the work.
education.
Yeah. I think we see that too, certainly through PIA and our work there. But I am interested in this distinction that you've made and Mark made, and then we're going to keep coming back to the programs versus systems piece. Dr. Kirwan, in Maryland, you've
Right.
recently led an effort to not set up a whole bunch of programs and kind of let 1,000 flowers bloom and see
Right.
what works, but you've been working with a large group of people to redesign a system and really rethink
Right.
it from the ground up, borrowing significantly from international models and trying to glean, take lessons that you can bring back to build a system, not a bunch of programs, and maybe a system that can support some of the employer engagement that Nancy's referencing here. Can you share with us a little bit about the changes the Commission's recommended, particularly with regards to CTE
Right.
and why? And maybe how that vision was influenced by the time that you spent looking at international systems?
Right. Well, it's a little hard to describe our
Just in a nutshell.
Yeah, I know. I understand our CTE system without speaking for a moment more broadly
Sure,
about what
please.
the Commission has done, because the pieces all fit together. And so I'll try to encapsulate 3 years of work in a few minutes. But what happened in 2016 is that the governor of the state and the General Assembly created this commission and asked it to develop policies and practices and a funding formula so that Maryland schools would perform at the level of the best performing schools in the world. An audacious charge. And in a weak moment, I came out of retirement to take on the most difficult job I've ever undertaken in my life. And so the first thing the Commission had to do was understand where are Maryland schools. And it was very troubling to find out where they were. Basically, Maryland student performance on assessment scores is very much in the middle of the pack in the country. And we all know the country is at best in the middle of the pack in the world. So the idea of getting Maryland from where it is to the top performing schools was a daunting challenge. We also saw we had huge funding inequity issues in the state. We had tremendous teacher attrition, and so it was not a pretty picture. And suddenly we're left to, how are we going to make our schools as good as the best? And one of the good things that came into my life, I learned about Mark Tucker and the NCEE, who spent the last 20 years studying the elements of high-performing, creating the building blocks for high-performing systems. So we brought Mark on as a consultant and worked very closely with him, and basically did for 2 years an intense study of where Maryland is in relation to the NCE building blocks and where the high performers are. And out of that came 5 major policy recommendations, and I'll get to the CTE in just a second. The first is a major investment in early childhood education and early childhood care so that many more kids come to kindergarten ready to learn. Secondly, rethink teaching as a profession. Make it a high-status profession, as they have done. I mean, there isn't a high-performing school system in the world where teaching isn't seen as a high status. If we don't do that in Maryland and across the country, we can forget ever matching these other schools. Create a curriculum that is benchmarked against the best performers in the world. Address the equity funding issues. And finally, to build a credible accountability system for the investment that would be required to make all this happen. So going back to the curriculum for just a moment, what the Commission recommended, or has recommended to the state, is that we significantly elevate our pathetic college and career ready standard. Right now, Maryland college and career ready standard is that you can read at the 10th grade level and do Algebra 1. And here's the shocking statistic. Fewer than 40% of high school graduates this past year met that standard. Now think about that. That should worry everybody. And believe me, if you think Maryland's special in this regard, forget it. You look across the country, you're going to find exactly the same thing. So what we did is we want to raise this college and career, we raised the college and career ready standard, we recommend it. So it is that you reach the college and career ready standard if you can take a college level course without remediation. That is the standard that we've set in Maryland. And what the commission has proposed is that we set as a goal that kids reach that standard by the 10th grade. And then in the 11th and 12th grade, they take advanced placement or international baccalaureate. That would be one pathway. Another pathway is early college, and they could end up with credits or a college degree. A third pathway would be a rigorous career and technical education or a vet program. Now, keep in mind, the kids in that pathway have already met the career and college, the college and career ready standards. So this is not a pathway for underperforming students. These are kids who've achieved the skills that they are ready to take credit-bearing courses in college. So now with that pathway, what we decided to do, and Mark was very influential at this, is take the control, the oversight of that out of the sole possession of the Department of Education. So we created a partnership with the trades, trade associations, the private sector, and education. There is the standards board that will have to develop and approve the curricula and the credentials. And the goal is that then this pathway will lead to an industry-recognized certification, or will articulate to a community college if there is some additional training required for that. What's interesting is that how popular this is. There was a poll recently in the state. Incidentally, as you can imagine, the commission's recommendations have gotten a lot of attention in the state and in the newspapers. But there was a poll about the 5 policy areas. They all were overwhelmingly endorsed in the state. But the #1 most popular recommendation in the state was the CTE recommendation. So it tells me, and I want to agree with you, that I think something is changing in the country. Look, people already question, is college worth it? You hear that all the time. And so there's a hunger out there for a pathway for kids where they get a good education, but then they have a skill that they can go into the workforce. So our goal in Maryland is to get 40% of our high school completers into this pathway.
The CTE pathway. So those students would be finishing 10th grade, they would meet a college and career readiness benchmark. Presumably the plan has every student meeting that benchmark, and then they can go in one of 3 directions.
It's one of 3 directions, and there would be different models. There could be in school career and technical education or vet training, but we've put a tremendous amount of emphasis on apprenticeships. So we're trying to build our program around the notion of apprenticeships for all sorts of reasons. But we can go into that.
Yeah, I just spent a week with a woman from the Maryland Department of Education in Germany, and she's taking everything back with her. So I can confirm that that's really happening. But so I'm curious, this idea that you'll have, it sounds like the plan is predicated to some extent on this expectation that all students will be able to meet that college and career readiness benchmark in 10th grade, which is hugely ambitious. It's absolutely the goal we should be setting for students, but it's a tough goal to reach.
Well, we acknowledge that not all students will. So our estimate, our projection is, this is a 10-year implementation plan that we have. And by year 10, our goal is to have 80% of kids meeting the college and career ready standard by the 10th grade.
By the 10th grade.
So then what happens to those kids who don't? Well, they're going to have special support and tutoring and help so that by the time they graduate, they will have met the college, at least a significant fraction of them would meet that standard. And while they're doing that, they could take some career and technical education courses. Yeah.
Okay, neat. Well, thank you for that clarification.
Sure.
I'm curious to hear what Janay, our panelist at the end, thinks of that. Janay's organization, National Alliance for Partnerships and Equity, is laser focused on working with education institutions and systems and educators, even frontline educators, especially in CTE programs, to build programmatic capacity to increase access and make sure that programs are serving students equitably. And certainly, this idea that over 10 years students would be meeting this benchmark is ambitious, and it is a goal we should be setting for our kids. I'm wondering if you have reactions to the plan or thoughts or even advice that you might offer the state of Maryland as they think about working to create these programs and ensure that they're really providing equitable opportunities for students who may not be meeting that benchmark at the 10th grade year or 11th grade year or even beyond.
So before I address that particularly, I just wanted to say a couple of things that I had heard that coming from the practitioner part of being with the students and working with the students, it's a different perspective than those who are at the top down building the systems, because when you're on the ground trying to implement them, it's easy for people who have studied it and said this is what you do, but when you're actually dealing with those students, that is a different scenario. So having worked in a school where those students are quote unquote the bottom line, the end result of all these great thoughts, the practical application of that really happening makes me cringe a little. And when I hear things, and it's, again, having read the book, and I do see all the value that's there, being able to look at some of the systems that are in place. Here in the United States, we're coming from a deficit of how we already have our education system set up and how it's not the most equitable environment that we're in, and the thought that even though China can move street sweepers to another level, we still have some unconscious bias that we look at certain populations and we don't see them moving into that level. So when we start talking about that we're going to get students to point A to point B, even in a tenure, is ambition, and I'm not knocking anyone's ambition. But I just like for us to stay grounded in equity and looking at it through that lens, because when we work with our state institutions and agencies, one of the things they say to us is, we're not getting enough people in the programs, or what tips can you give us, or what are the best practices? And the best practices and tips don't work if we're not changing our mindset, if we're still using unconscious bias as our lens for thinking of who belongs in those chairs. And so when we talk to the gatekeepers, whether that's the administrators, whether that's the counselors, whether that's the admissions officers, it even goes back to that 9th grade counselor who sees that student for the first time and makes an assumption that you belong over here or you belong over there. I have to say I was the biggest disappointment in 6th grade because I'm not a basketball player. And teachers saw my height and they're like, oh, there you go. I was like, I can't make a basket if you put her in front of me. But the assumption was that that's what I wanted to do. I had no desire to do sports. I wanted to do something else. But because we have preconceived notions of what our students are going to be, when we're making decisions about how to deal with our students, we have to keep them at the forefront, and we have to keep equity at the forefront. So I would be interested, before I could give advice to Maryland, is what are your thoughts and planning on how you're going to get students just up to the level? Having saw that we have students who are not meeting 4th grade reading and writing and math, that's startling enough, and that's every student in the United States. We spent a time where it was a teach-to-test model, and we're still reeling from that teach-to-test model. Then we spent a time saying culturally, everyone must go to college. So again, I heard it mentioned about parents, and parents are another factor that we don't consider, because in many cultures that we don't think about, going to college is the pinnacle. So I would love for someone to sit and tell an African-American family who's worked really hard to get their student to college ready to say, no, I want you to go back and work in manufacturing, even if manufacturing has changed. So it's a lot of factors that we haven't considered. And so when I read the book and looked at it, I was like, these are all great. I think it's wonderful. And the biggest one that popped up was the partner of working with industry. Because again, as we train people, and they say we want more people involved, but this hand is open to say give, but they're not giving anything in return, whether that's funding for training, whether that's opportunity to come in and talk to the students about real world experience. And working with PIA and the whole apprenticeship program has definitely opened up my eyes as far as where we need to go, because there is a stigmatism around CTE and what that represents. And so to get us to being the pinnacle of this high performing system, we have to deal with the low performing system that we created a long time ago. And we can't overlook it, even if we do change the name. We can't overlook the fact that the system itself is broken, and before we can think about building it to get people to a higher achieving, they need to just achieve at the level that we put for them right now.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's an important practitioner perspective, and I think the idea too that you mentioned about how are we going to get kids ready to that 10th grade level is something we haven't really addressed today in conversation. There's some references in the book, and I know, Vivien, that some of your work in Singapore and some of your recent work in China has opened your eyes to some of the ways that other countries think about these equity challenges and some of the strategies that they've employed successfully and unsuccessfully to try to address some of the challenges that they face that are different than those that we face, but certainly related to Janay's point about systems that exist that are very poor and have inequities just sort of baked into the design, and also some of the biases that exist in the society. So do you have any thoughts for what lessons we might glean, particularly around these equity and access issues from countries that you've studied or the chapters that you've contributed in the book, or books that you've written that are on Bill Gates' favorite book lists?
Well, let me just come at that. Mark already made some of these points, but let me just come at it, particularly trying to address the issue of prestige and stigma, and also equity. And I'll talk more about Singapore than China. They're both going down the same direction. They decided, they've always had vocational education, but it was low skill, low prestige, just like ours. But in the 80s, Singapore, and in the 2005-ishes, China, both countries decided they were going to make a huge commitment to vocational education and training, comparable to the commitment they make to their universities. And they did it for two reasons. One is economic. Mark's already described how Singapore looks to where it wants to go and then builds the skills so that those employers will come there. And China recognized that it's not going to be the low-skill manufacturer of the world, or doesn't want to be, forever. And if they're going to go from made in China, meaning crap, to made in China being as high quality as made in Japan and Korea, they really needed to work on these technical skills. And they were quite dissatisfied with their universities, actually, which were producing very well-trained, academically trained students whom industry didn't want. They said they can't do a thing. They're just too academic. But the second thrust for both places was the equity concern, because there simply was nowhere for the minority students, the three groups that are not Chinese, in Singapore to go. They were in the bottom stream of a highly streamed system, and there was nowhere for them to go in the labor market as it was evolving. And in China, you obviously have rural as a sort of mass of people who are not being served by the current very academic system that they've developed over 30 years. But on the prestige side, Singapore is kind of interesting because when the ITEs were set up, in the first one was in the 80s, the other Institutes for Technical Education, which are sort of the new thing in their technical education system. ITE, jokingly, in the public discourse, stood for "it's the end."
It's the end.
So how do you, just because the government decides it's important doesn't mean everybody else will begin to think it's important. So a number of the things Mark touched on, I think, have been important in bringing about a change in prestige. Certainly these beautiful buildings that you walk into and you think, I'd like to study here, was a part of it. The link to economic development and employers, which meant that when you came out, you actually got a good job. And I think it was actually the high rates of job placement out of the ITEs that turned people's, that eventually made the swing to people seeing it as prestigious and maybe a serious alternative to universities. Work experience, I mean, I think parents were glad to see their students working in real jobs as opposed to perhaps the lower expectations they might have had about where they could have gone. And critically, I think, because it didn't exist in either Singapore or China, structural reform so that there was a bridge from a technical institution into a university. So now, because they used to be completely separate, so one really was literally a dead end. And now in Singapore, you can go from a technical college to a technical institute to a polytechnic to a university, and something like a quarter of the students that start off at the ITEs end up going to university later. So I think that was very, very important. It's not that we're trying to say to Princeton, you need to offer vocational courses.
Exactly.
There's still the university sector there for those who want it, but there's all these other alternatives which have high academic standards.
And implications for equity, too, right?
And another thing they have also done is introduce much more serious career guidance in schools, not individual counselors, but curricula at the elementary, middle, and high school level. Nancy talked about that as a big gap here, so that students from the beginning were seeing, oh, there are all these other careers over here that I didn't know about. So I think all of those things help to shift the perception, but particularly getting a lot of good jobs.
Sure.
And on the equity front and getting kids up to high standards, in both Singapore and China, they will tell you they're not there yet, but in terms of, you can see, looking at the more developed parts of China, not the rural parts of China, and in Singapore, that they certainly don't have as big a bottom as we do. They manage to get more students up to higher levels. They pay a lot of attention to early childhood. And then Singapore, when you enter school, if you're seen as being behind or speaking a language, not speaking English well enough, which most students don't come into school speaking English, you automatically have a longer school day with tutoring until you catch up. In other words, you're never allowed to fall behind. So they set the standards very high, but they give a lot of support to those who, and it's systematic, of course, because everything there is. In Shanghai, they've developed a lot of interesting models in which high-performing schools are asked to help run low-performing schools. And that seems to be both sort of from a principal point of view and from teacher development point of view. And that's seen as part of your social obligation, if you're in a high-performing school, to do that. If you're a teacher in Shanghai and you want to go to the top of the career ladder, you have to have worked in a low-performing school at some part. So they are also kind of working on this. I would just say, I mean, China only started its big VET push around 2010, so it's too early to say. It's very similar sets of ideas. The ideas are all the same. It'd be much harder to do there. It's huge. You know, Singapore's like some of our states. China, you could fit, you know, several USs into China. Very varied economic development, many different levels of government. And big bureaucracies that don't communicate. So it's going to be much harder to make that, to build a system in China than in Singapore or in Maryland, I think.
So a couple of things that you described there that I think are consistent across some of the leading systems that are in the book. The first is the piece that you just mentioned about building these systems so that they are, I think the term that we would use in the States is permeable, right? That students who start in one track and think that a vocational education is what they want can, if, you know, at a certain point in their career, kind of make a right turn or a left turn and enter a more traditional academic path and continue to sort of earn credentials in the same field, but that might look sort of different than the applied or vocational credentials that they have in the initial institution where they may have started their training. And that's something that you just mentioned that China is trying to figure out how to do that. Singapore certainly made strides in developing that. The Swiss, of course, are sort of famous for the impossible to read maps that have lines going all sorts of diagonal, and same with the Germans. That's something I think that, you know, the US might purport to have, but the pathways are certainly not clear or smooth or navigable for most people. So certainly a lesson that we can pull. One thing that we've talked about, and each of you have mentioned it in a very different capacity, though, is this question of employers, right? And so what, like, I just kind of want to leave it there and let you just respond. But the employer culture in the U.S. is obviously very different than in the economies featured in the book. And it's something that we really haven't, like a nut we haven't really cracked here, and there's certainly a lot of interest, but it's kind of disparate, and it looks different depending on where you go. They have sort of different thresholds of cooperation with public institutions or really any other institution or systems. So I'm curious whether this is a question about how to get them involved and organized, or Janay, you made the point sort of about unconscious bias and working with employers, whether it's a question about engaging them in sort of a system and getting them really to come to the table as partners in this work, and open-minded partners that are invested in not just developing talent that they need tomorrow, but developing systems that allow them to engage with education institutions and really think about how we are as systems developing talent and how they're interacting with not just the individuals, but systems, education systems. Are there lessons from the countries that you've all profiled or that you've seen in your work that you think are most valuable for us to take back on this employer question? How do we get them to engage with education systems in developing these models in ways that are promising, not just for them, but for the students and the education institutions with whom they partner?
Well, I'll start. As I said, we've worked for now 3 years on this commission report. We're fortunately almost done. But we had, as part of the effort, we had work groups of commission members and others that were developing the specific recommendations. So we brought the trades, the private sector into the work groups at a very early stage to help shape the recommendations. We didn't hand them the recommendations. We got them involved in as I say, developing these, and they were very excited. I mean, they were very willing partners, and at the end of the day, we came to the conclusion that they had to be partners in the oversight of. It couldn't be just education. They've got to be at the table. In fact, the chair of the oversight board, our recommendation is someone from the trades or the private sector. Educators are on the board, but they I think, feel ownership of this. And I feel that's the case because we brought them in very early, and they helped shape the final report.
And they were willing.
Oh, absolutely. Very enthusiastic.
Yeah. Nancy?
So I don't think there's a whole lot we're going to learn from other countries about how to do this. I think we know the lessons that it's absolutely critically important, but I think we're going to have to develop our own U.S. version of employer engagement. There have been attempts in our work over many years now to get associations interested. What we have seen, and somewhat promising, is we do a lot of skills mapping backward from employers. And when you have employers in a particular sector in a room and they're actually working on back mapping the skills to what's taught in a community college, they do feel like there's considerable buy-in. But how you do that on a large scale, I don't know. I mean, Jamie Dimon, for example, has been a major voice for engaging employers. We've had innumerable conferences, convenings. There are lots of people who raise their hands, but I think there are some really tough challenges ahead. One of them, I think, is the dim view that most employers have of 16-year-olds, if you're thinking about how you get younger people
or
into
those bottom of the list millennials.
Yeah, well, that's a whole other problem. What am I supposed to say? You're supposed to say, okay, boomer. But I remember being interviewed by somebody from a Swiss newspaper in New York City one day, and they simply couldn't understand why there was such a prejudice against 16-year-olds when what makes the system work so well in Switzerland is that 16-year-olds are actually doing productive work. We saw 16-year-olds advising hedge fund, sitting next to a hedge fund advisor or working on reviewing home loans. And so that's one big issue. So we always get asked, the first questions are about confidentiality and liability. When we say we'd like to have 16-year-olds in a company. In fact, OSHA says the only thing you can't do is drive a forklift. So there's that set of issues, view of 16-year-olds, and then there's just this work culture. That's why I'm so interested in this new phenomenon, because somehow there's a disconnect between what we are asking and what employers now seem to be ramping up themselves. So how we make these connections somehow, it seems like we have to figure this out in a different way. I think the economy, if we hurry up before the recession sets in, the economy will be helpful because people are really hungry for employees, scrambling for talent. Yeah. But I don't have easy answers to this one.
Just a couple of things to. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, she looked at me, but I think she was.
No, I
talking
just
to
saw
me.
Vivien writing, so I wanted to make sure she.
I always write. That's how I keep myself focused. Just a quick comment on China. China used to have really good cooperation between VET and employers because it was all part of the state-owned enterprise system.
Yeah.
But now that a lot of those are being dismantled, they're actually trying to take that training out. And they don't have good contacts between government and the employees. So they have a worse problem, actually, than we do. In Singapore, it's a mixture of the government providing incentives and insisting as a matter of policy that employers who come to Singapore pay into a training fund, and then they can take funds out of it if they offer apprenticeship opportunities. But they also provide a lot of incentives to companies to come there.
Sure.
So it's not that the companies are just doing this of their own free will. I actually think it's hard to generalize about U.S. employees. I think you have to look at different groups because you clearly there are some that are very global and they don't care what the local labor force is. They'll pick up and move somewhere. You have others like the tech sector in California that thinks, well, we just need more HB1B visas and we don't have to bother about U.S. talent because that's a much cheaper way of getting people who will stay a long time. And then you have others in other states. And I think this is where the state framework is so helpful because you can actually talk to the actual employers in that state about what their needs are.
And even U.S. employers who go to other systems and are willing participants in it, right?
And
It's
one
very
just on the
strange.
16-year-old point, a number of countries, Singapore is one, but in a number of the European countries, are really now starting to put some sort of policy flesh on this idea of lifelong learning that we've been talking about forever, but don't have any real policies to incentivize by having skill credits for all employees. And so that the assumption is you're going to need to go back and get a particular, some skill at some point.
Sure.
And that's also attractive to employers because they don't have to pay for the cost of constantly reskilling their workforce.
So I'm getting the sign that we're out of time here. I want to make sure that, see if Janay has a comment she'd like to close us with, and then I'm going to try my luck to see if people are going to let us take questions. But do you have a last word? Oh, I'm getting a head shake.
I was just going to say, we were talking about employers, just the idea of the connecting with them and the return on their investment. I think that's important. So when you look at the book, you see that connection, and employers have to see, what am I going to get out of this?
Yep.
And I think being able to invite them to the table early and actually interact with the students as well is going to help to change some of that mindset about working with younger people.
Sure. Yeah, and I think pushing them, too, to think about not just being consumers of the talent education produces, but partners in producing it, right? And that's can be sort of part of the ROI conversation, but also it requires us to kind of flip that a little bit in some ways and involve them in the production process. So I don't want to cut you off. I could continue this conversation for a long time. We are at 7 o'clock. I am going to wait for someone who's out here organizing to see if we can take one or two questions. Yes? Okay, we have someone lined up. First question in the back. Sir, if you want to, we have a mic coming for you, but if you have a teacher voice.
Yeah, I make it short. What we forgotten here is that
Oh, here, will you speak to the mic just so folks, thank you.
what we are forgetting frequently is the money. What I mean here, and you probably know it, at least to my knowledge, Germany, Austria, Netherlands, Denmark as well. The companies are offering significant tax incentives. And that is a boost, obviously, to accept as many as possible those apprentices. That's what we might use here in the US, which would significantly help it. Now, the second one, maybe radical, maybe too radical, but with those community colleges, 70% of those kids are going to work anyway. Why we not morph partially those community colleges to apprenticeship? They are going to work anyway. They basically are going to wrong work maybe.
Yeah.
But maybe we can realign and we will have an excellent education, 2 years, 2.5 years, apprenticeship, and we can produce immediately excellent quality. Now, and then my comment. I'm still struggling with the comparing United States of America and the small countries. I mean, Switzerland, 8 million like New York. On the other side, we have the United States of Europe. Obviously, they will never confirm that they are going in our direction. I think it would be fair to compare maybe Massachusetts to Switzerland, Denmark to Tennessee, whatever is it. And then we are looking slightly differently.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start with the first point, the tax incentive question. Nancy, you had a comment right off the bat.
That we've tried it. But I don't think we've tried it in any really significant way. But the other thing is that Switzerland, the employers pay the wages completely. They pay a sum that is less than they would pay for a full-time, well-trained, entry-level worker, but they still pay the wages. There is, however, a huge investment that remains somewhat hidden of infrastructure from the government and the local cantons to make it possible for all of that to happen. But I don't know that tax incentives are, I mean, I only think that we are going to have either huge pressure because of the demographic shifts and the talent pipeline problems, or we're not going to get where we need to go. There are several companies, we've worked with one for years, the wonderful company in California, employers who put huge amounts of their own money into working with high schools and community colleges, but they are a rare example. They're both a philanthropy and they're in need of a workforce. So I don't think tax incentives will do it.
I was going to say, on the point, do you want to stay on the tax incentives?
Nope, go
Okay.
for it.
So I think the point of looking at the state as the entity is a really good one. Because, all these high performers, they have a single Ministry of Education that controls everything all across the country. Well, we have that in the state. We're never going to have it at the national level, but we have it in each state. So I think the focus of attention should be on the states developing these CTE programs.
And that's what we've, in our pathways work,
Right.
that's what we've been doing
Right.
for 10 years.
Yeah, I agree with the focus on the states, although not, so there are a number of federal systems that are high performing too. Just like Germany and Canada, certainly much more high performing than the
Right.
US.
Yeah,
So they're not
that's
all
true.
small, unitary.
Yeah.
And most of them have decentralized from their Ministry of Education. This image that it's all driven from the top is not
Okay.
true anymore.
I think we have time for one more question over here, unless Janay, you wanted to get a word in? No? Okay, one more question, and then I know we've got folks who have to scramble to the airport, so.
Like me.
Go to her granddaughter's birthday.
Oh.
Thank you, and it'll be quick. Question for Bill. First of all, just so I don't misstate what the goal that you put forth. Did you say something like the goal should be 40% of high school?
Right.
Could you characterize it, just so I don't misstate it?
Oh, so the target in our report is that 40% of the college and career-ready students would follow the career and technical education pathway.
My question for you is, that seems to cannibalize the community that is aiming for college. Janay made what I think was a critical point about that. When people are shooting for that for however long, instead of 40% of that group being the target, why not make the target be 80 or 90% of those who don't opt for college?
Well, basically it is, because the other two pathways are early college and the advanced placement baccalaureate, national baccalaureate. So, 2/3 of the students are headed towards a college track, and many of the ones on the career and technical education will also be taking college courses because they've met the college and career ready standard.
So on that cheerful note.
Yes.
So we could go on, and I know that there are other questions, but we are over time, and we will not be the ones to stand between you and the bar. But if you could just join me in thanking our panel, and also thanking Mark and NCEE for bringing us together. Thank you. Don't be late for that birthday party.
Forget the system. It is broken. We've got to start all over. And that's what's reality. Absolutely. Exactly. You have to start over.
So I just want to thank everyone for coming, and please invite you to have some snacks.